Let's continue taking a look at SAA and some of the big business and economic stories from the week. I'm joined by Duma Gqubule. He's a director at the Center of Economic Development. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News today. Let's start with that SAA story and stay with it. We know that National Treasury has sent a letter to business rescue practitioners committing 10.5 billion rand to try and rescue SAA. Is it enough, and is it money well spent?
You know, Nziga, I think this is one of the most saddest stories in our post-apartheid history. First of all, as you correctly said in the clip, we've had a decade of mismanagement of this airline. But what people should understand is that the problems at SAA were not at the ESCOM level. It was much easier to sort out. So there was a gap for 10 years between revenue and costs. So they accumulated debt and losses over the past decade. Now, I can't for the life of me understand why they couldn't narrow the gap between revenues and costs. That's number one. Number two, there was a plan by Duma Gqubule, the former CEO, to recapitalize this airline with about 22 billion rands. So this crazy plan to collapse the airline by the government, they will end up paying exactly what Duma Gqubule said they should pay. There's 10.5 billion rands now, there's debt of 15 billion rands, and whatever other costs, we're talking about 30 billion rands. So this crazy plan to deliberately collapse the airline will not save South Africans a cent, because the cost of this whole exercise, starting a new airline, recapitalizing this balance sheet of the SAA, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Let's stay with the issue of rescue. We've heard about that NEDLAC meeting that took place. There's a plan that's been sent to Cabinet. Do we know what's in that plan that's waiting for Cabinet approval?
Okay, Nzinga, I think many South Africans were disappointed on Wednesday when the President failed to announce a recovery plan. It's 6 months after he declared a state of rescue, and we still don't have a plan to cushion the economy and stimulate the economy. Remember, we're going to have a 11.5% decline in GDP this year, according to the OECD. There's going to be massive increases in unemployment, and there still isn't a plan to address the economic issues in our country. So I just think that, so I think that's a big disappointment for the week. And if you read the previous government plan that was a NEDLAC, it was quite clear that it was the weakest of all the plans of all the stakeholders, and it required a lot of work from the government. But it's already quite clear what's going to be in the plan. There's going to be an employment plan of 19.6 billion, which was provisionally allocated in the supplementary budget, and that will be used to develop an employment strategy. The other element of it is Operation Vulindlela, where Treasury has said that they're going to repackage structural reforms that the government failed to implement over a decade and repackage them as a new strategy. So those are the two elements of the plan that we know of. Now, what the plan is missing is a continued humanitarian response. The grants are going to finish the grants and the UIF payments are going to be finished in October, and many people we won't be able to provide any assistance to people in terms of the humanitarian response. I just have to mention one thing. You know, when there's an earthquake, the first thing you do is to look after the families of those people who are affected by the earthquake. You provide them with food and income support. And only after that, you start rebuilding the city or the country where the earthquake had. You had the earthquake, but you can't start the rebuilding before you sort out the immediate humanitarian crisis. And I just think that there isn't enough focus in terms of our response from the immediate humanitarian crisis. Because we're going to have a crisis of rising unemployment. I expect 2 million increase in unemployment for this year to about 12.5 to 13 million people. We'll be at 45% unemployment. The unemployment rate for Black African females will be 50%. The unemployment rate in the Eastern Cape will be more than 50%. Now you will have half of our country's, half of the people in our country unemployed in those areas. It's just unacceptable that we should have an immediate humanitarian response. And the employment response, quite frankly, is too little and too late.
I know you've quoted the OECD figures when there was that MPC meeting and the announcement of that, the Reserve Bank yesterday saying they now expect an 8.2% contraction in GDP, and they also kept rates unchanged after that meeting. I know you're quite clear about what you always feel the Reserve Bank should be doing in terms of rates. What's your response to that prediction and that interest rate decision yesterday?
Okay, let's just be clear. The Reserve Bank, every single forecast they made was wrong. Now, before the lockdown, they came up with the wrong, they said they didn't know there was going to be a lockdown, so they came up with the wrong forecast. Now, all of us knew that there would be a lockdown, and I can't understand. So what I'm trying to say is that the Reserve Bank forecasts are always wrong. And I'm completely failed to understand why we can't cut interest rates further. There's no excuse not to cut interest rates closer to zero, because we're in a depression. In a depression, by definition, there is zero inflationary pressures because there's too little money chasing too many goods. So there's deflationary impulses in the economy. So if you pump money into the economy, there will be no inflation. What you've seen, Zinga, is that the currency has depreciated by 15%, but it hasn't resulted in inflation because of this depression that we're in. I just don't understand why the central bank cannot cut interest rates and introduce new policy tools that you're seeing throughout the world. There's been unprecedented innovation in central banks in developing and developed countries in terms of how to support their economies during this pandemic. Many countries have resorted to printing money and to creating facilities for all sectors of society. In the United States, they created 12 lending facilities for local governments, for companies, it's like a whole suite of support given to people across the country.
Duma Gqubule, thanks so much for your time, Director at the Center of Economic Development, joining me there via Zoom.